Good afternoon. I'm Gene Policinski. I'm Chief Operating Officer of the Newseum Institute, which is the programs and initiative part of the Newseum. We're very pleased to have you here and to be partnering once again with CPJ for a program that I think is, well, our programs with them are always remarkable. They are always an opportunity to be reminded of something that I hope that this facility and that our programs can do on a daily basis, and that's remind the world of how committed journalists are to their profession and how dangerous a profession it is. This morning we had a chance to rededicate a feature of ours on the fourth level, the World Press Freedom Map, produced in conjunction with Freedom House. This year, once again, it demonstrates that 13% of the world's population, 1 out of 7, live in a country where the press is deemed to be free. 6 out of 7 are in countries where the press is partially or not free, and it's green, yellow, and red, and if you look at that map, it's pretty distressing to see the colors that aren't not green. And we're very pleased to be partnering today in this program particularly because so much of what our work here on a daily basis or a regular basis is about is telling the public what journalism is really like, from presidential candidates, frankly, to people who answer all those polls. I think there's a misperception about what journalists do, who they are, where they come from, what their goals are, and almost always, I think, a failure to realize the true threat across a range of dangers that journalists face. We'll rededicate the Journalist Memorial on this level, June 6th, and with the assistance of CPJ and other international groups, we're able to review each year and find a representative group of journalists who signify all the terrible ways that journalists place themselves in danger, and some pay the ultimate price every year. This year, I can tell you, there will be a group of 20 out of 11 incidents whose names will be added to the memorial, representing all of the journalists that we know and don't know in an internet age who are endangered. We try to do programs throughout the year. Many of you I see at those programs that make the effort to say that journalism, while it has its faults, and is sometimes worthy of criticism, is also sometimes worthy of praise and admiration. I would have no higher goal than to have you leave this room today, have visitors, more than 800,000 a year, leave this building saying about journalism, however I felt going in, I feel differently when I come out. And they do that in knowledge. Today's program, I hope, will do that. We'd like to invite you to see those parts of the Newseum on a regular basis that salute journalism, that memorialize journalism, that honor those practitioners, but also talk about the intersection of journalism and the difficult task of getting it right. And sometimes we don't. We're also about all 5 freedoms here. So we have a Religious Freedom Center. We talk about free speech. We talk about the rights of petition and assembly, that modest little 75-foot stone plaque in the front of the building. We think that's particularly nice in a building otherwise very transparent. We want that to be, for those who might travel up and down Pennsylvania Avenue occasionally, to see those words written in stone. So again, welcome to this program. And now the chairman of CPJ's board, Sandy Rowe.
Thank you very much, Gene, and thank you to the Newseum for having us here. You received the new, fresh off the press, I couldn't even get an advance copy, got mine today too, of Attacks on the Press, and this book is sponsored and underwritten for CPJ by Bloomberg Press and Bloomberg News, so thanks to them. This is a different approach. We've been publishing this book for years, and this year, and sometimes we go country by country, but this year we decided to take a look through the whole book at sexualized violence, gender harassment, and online attacks, and more broadly at the intersection of gender and press freedom. The genesis for this really became apparent 5 years ago. And 5 years ago, it was after Lara Logan was attacked and other women had been attacked, and CPJ realized that we really had not done enough. We knew it would be difficult to report, but report it we did, and we published a report called The Silencing Crime, in which we undertook to really examine that. The resulting attention to the issue and to Lara herself illustrated heartbreakingly the consequences, both professional and personal, to women who are attacked. Laura's here today and will share some of that with us. 5 years later, I can tell you that the landscape is better in some ways, but in some ways it's worse. And so Attacks on the Press examines sexualized violence and online harassment from a variety of perspectives. In those perspectives, we have, in the book, there's an essay by Colombian journalist Jeneth Bedoya Lima, who provides a harrowing and moving account of being raped 16 years ago by men who sought to punish her for reporting on arms trafficking and to terrorize others who might pursue similar stories. Bedoya would not be silenced. Words can indeed change the world, she notes in this essay. But words, we are finding, can also do tremendous harm. Today we will discuss the damage caused by internet trolls who target women reporters for abuse, including threats of physical and sexual violence. Michelle Ferrier, with us today, describes in Attacks on the Press the emotional toll inflicted by relentless denigration and verbal assault. Ferrier captures the feelings of fear, helplessness, and isolation of those experiencing unceasing insults. Unless it has happened to you, it is hard to imagine what this kind of stalking feels like, she writes. Also with us, panelist Arzu Geybullayeva tells about living in self-imposed exile from Azerbaijan, even as her friend and colleague is behind bars convicted of trumped-up charges. So Arzu works here and around the world where she can to bring her friends support and to advance her cause. CPJ is committed to doing even more to document the violation of women journalists so we can better understand the scope of these violations and, more importantly, how to address it. And today's events are part of that. So I would like to thank our panelists for being here and thank especially Martha Raddatz, the Chief Global Affairs Correspondent for ABC News, for moderating this panel. Thank you. And thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, and thanks, of course, to the CPJ and to the Newseum. I want to briefly just go down and introduce again each of our panelists. I also want you to think of questions out there, and there is no question that's stupid. There are questions that are too long, however, so. I've done a fair bit of moderating. If you get to that point, you'll know it, though. I want to start to my right, Molly McCluskey, who is a freelance foreign correspondent based in D.C. and Europe, but she has been in conflict zones all around the world. Dr. Ferrier, you heard the introduction, but she is Associate Dean of Innovation at the Scripps College of Communication at Ohio University and Associate Professor in the E.W. Scripps School of Journalism. She does indeed write eloquently in this new book. Arzu Geybullayeva, an Azerbaijani journalist and blogger based in Istanbul, and her chapter, as you just heard in the book, focuses on the sexualized character assassinations she and her friend, who is now in jail, endured. And my friend Lara Logan, CBS 60 Minutes correspondent and CPJ board member. And Lara and I have crossed the world together on occasion, but I don't think we've actually ever run into each other. We're both kind of independent operators.
A couple times in Baghdad.
Yes, a couple of times in Baghdad, that's right. How easily we forget those days.
It was more memorable for me than for Martha, obviously.
I want to start with you, Lara, and I know you have spoken about this today at a lunch a short time ago, but you explained so eloquently and courageously what happened to you in Tahrir Square in February 2011. I can't believe it's 5 years, and I'm sure you can't either. I want you to talk not so much about the event, but about your process of wanting to talk about it and sort of how that evolved from the moment it happened to when you spoke to Scott Pelley on 60 Minutes. How that happened.
So it's funny you say from the moment it happened, because that's when I really did know. I mean, once I could breathe again, and I knew that I wasn't going to die.
I'm sorry, they're saying they can't quite hear you, Lara. You know, come on, you're on TV. We're always the
What am I
worst
doing here?
because someone else does
testing,
it for us.
Testing, is that better? So, it's not very good, is it? There we go. Is that better?
I think that's good.
When I, no, you can't hear now, can you? Okay. So, during the attack, obviously, I was fighting for my life, so I didn't have a lot of time to think. But from the moment that the Egyptian soldiers carried me from the square, it wasn't. I just knew automatically when I was reunited with my team. The only thing I could say in those moments was to my producer Max McClellan, "You can't believe what they did to me. You can't believe what they did to me." But when I was lying in the square, still very, very afraid, and the mob was still right there, and I was stripped naked, the Egyptian soldiers wouldn't touch me until I had clothes on. And it was a very difficult moment for me because I knew that the mob was right there, and that moment that I'd had where I'd been in the process of dying, and now I had a chance where I thought I actually might survive, was very tenuous and fragile, and the fear was really indescribable. But when the soldiers brought an abaya, the full black covering, and put it over me and picked me up, I think was really the moment that I knew then, even without processing it, that I would talk about what happened to me, because I felt like I disappeared in that moment. So I went from the most traumatic experience of my life, and honestly, I never expected to see the other side of that. There was a long period of time in there where I was very close to death, and when I came back, to the hotel, the Egyptian doctor who was treating me didn't want me to tell him. I wanted to tell him what happened to me, and he didn't want to know, because that was more than he could process. And he just kept saying to me, "Stop talking, you're lucky to be alive." And no one could look at me. So I had a team of people at 60 Minutes, all of whom I know well and respect and like very, very much, and no one could look at me. Some of them I'd been, we'd slept literally in the dirt in Afghanistan and Ramadi and Iraq, all over, and suddenly these men couldn't talk to me. And I couldn't stand it that no one could, I just felt like I disappeared. And I quickly realized that no one really understood what had happened, because I bore yes, I was hysterical and I was naked and all of that, but I didn't have a gunshot wound or a blast wound or something that everyone can identify and easily deal with. And I remember my producer sitting at the end of my bed talking to my boss about what we were going to do with the story. And that was the moment when I realized they don't understand. They don't understand at all what just happened here. And I asked my producer to clear the room. And I said, I need you to get my husband on the phone. And I got my husband on the phone, and I said, I'm going to ask you to do two things. I'm going to ask you to listen. I'm going to tell you everything they did to me. And then I want you to hang up and call my boss. I want you to call Jeff Fager at 60 Minutes and tell him. Because I knew instinctively that I needed it to be known and understood. And then, the process of getting to the hospital and dealing with all of that, and then CBS putting out their statement, I really didn't expect the outpouring of support that I got from other journalists particularly, and from people all over the country and all over the world. And that was really a great thing for me. It helped me put myself back together. But as I've said many times before, it wasn't difficult for me to make that decision about speaking out, because I'm always a person who I was raised to stand up for what I believe in, and I was not raised to keep silent in the face of injustice or wrongdoing, and it wasn't hard for me to speak out about it. I think what is harder for victims of sexual violence, rape, sexual assault, is that people like to bury it very quickly, and they want you to show and prove to everyone that you've moved on and you're okay. And you can be okay, and you can have moved on, but you have to accept that sexual violence is always going to be part of your life. It's not like something bad that happened to you that you can just bury and say, I'm not going to think about it again. Because, the reality is that, sure, there are going to be times when I'm alone with my husband, And, you know, he will do something, and it takes me straight back to that moment in the square. And fortunately, I have a strong, you know, relationship with a secure, like a smart person, and I can say, this is a bad moment for me. And he can understand that it's not about him. But sexual assault lives with you forever because the trigger is always there. If you're married or in a relationship or, you know, enjoying a normal, healthy life. And that's a part of the conversation that I think is missing. And it's about realizing that overcoming something isn't just leaving it behind. It's finding a way to live with it and be okay with it. And I've had, you know, young journalists from Egypt and other places come and see me to talk to me about things that have happened to them. And you realize that the first step is not having to carry that burden on your own. And many people wrote to me, there's so many women and men all over the world who carry that burden on their own still today. And that's really, it's those people that my heart goes out to, because that's the hardest part.
Lara, I'm really interested in what you say. I mean, it's almost, I'm thinking of invisible wounds. As you said, you couldn't go in there. One of the things the media does is protect victims of sexual violence, never naming, never being explicit about things. What do you think? I'd like to know what all of you think about that.
Well, you know, that's like, I just came back from Iraq, or doing a story with the Yazidis and the genocide of the Yazidi people. And, you know, like, for example, the women there didn't cover their faces in the interviews. And I actually stopped them and said, you need to cover your face, because I think it's my responsibility as a journalist. I understand the implications of putting them on 60 Minutes. Telling their stories. They're not equipped to understand that, because they don't even know what 60 Minutes is. Not you know, which is not to say anything less about them. It's just that in a Yazidi village in northern Iraq, that's, you know, no one's got the TV on watching it on a Sunday evening. So I think we should protect people. That doesn't mean, that doesn't absolve you from your responsibility in your work, though, because obviously you treat it the same as if you were identifying it. You go through all the same processes, and if you don't, you know, we've seen what happens if you don't.
Do you, Arzu, think it adds to a sense of shame if people don't talk about it? I mean, very understandable that you want people who are in immediate risk on that, but in terms of the media kind of protecting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two cases. I mean, two ways to go about this. I mean, if this is a journalist we're talking about who's been sexually assaulted, you obviously want not only your community of journalists to hear about her story in order to prevent this from happening, but also, you know, more of an international audience to know about what is happening in a country like Azerbaijan, for instance, where I'm from. I think this is a little bit different with victims of sexual harassment who are not journalists but just women. I think in Azerbaijan, at least in my experience, a lot of these women tend to prefer not go public about it. I mean, quite often they don't even report about sexual assault, and it's really difficult to reach out and actually find the victims and talk to them and tell them that they have a voice and that they have a right to speak out in order to prevent this from happening again. So I think it kind of, there are two ways to go about this, and in particular countries like Azerbaijan, where, you know, it's still a very patriarchal society. You know, sex before marriage is still a taboo subject, and quite often women feel like they're not empowered and they don't have the voice to expose what happens to them.
Dr. Ferrier.
I think on the opposite side of that problem of identifying the victims of the problems that we see online, with not being able to report fully the breadth of the kinds of tweets and social media comments that women and women of color and others get online, and online harassment. When we go to report what's happening in those spaces, we can't fully use the language that's being used against us online in the newspaper, because it is a public forum, because it is a place where others might see that. And so I don't think the public can fully understand the impact of what's happening in online harassment, because we can't describe
Tell your
it
own story as...
my background, I worked in a newspaper in Florida for several years back in the early 2000s, and worked as a night news editor and a columnist there, the first African-American columnist at this newspaper. And so if we think before the days of social media, the only people that had their faces in the newspaper were the columnists. And so I received hate mail over a period of 3 years from individuals, and those I would tuck into a little folder and ignore them. But I received a series of letters, more manifestos, from one particular writer over a period of 3 years. The letters talked about everything from how do you get an N out of the tree, cut the rope, to there's going to be a race war against you N people. And the columns I wrote were lifestyle columns that were very much about me and my family and really helping my audience get a glimpse into my life as an African-American mother and somebody in the community and as a journalist and what that life was like. And so my column was really designed to bridge the gaps, gender, of race, of ethnicity, of age, and help that audience really understand that we all put our pants on the same way, generally. However, this letter writer continued to persist in sending me letters over the course of the 3 years, and the letters continued to escalate in the violence. I went to the local police, and really, they could not. I was getting letters through the mail. They couldn't investigate or wouldn't investigate. Went to the local FBI, finally went to the CIA, went to federal FBI, and it finally was the Committee to Protect Journalists almost 10 years ago that took up my case and went to the Department of Justice and asked them to look into my case. Of course, as you'll see in my story, nothing actually happened. And so one of the very last letters that I received from this writer was so off the rails that I finally told my husband we couldn't keep our children safe. At that time, I had started disguising myself and carrying a gun to protect myself. My children had cell phones before anyone else. The police, to their credit, did patrol my neighborhood. Occasionally, when I'd get a letter, and then the patrols would die down, and then another letter would come, and the patrols would start back up again. But I was living in fear, and so were my children every day. And when I received that last letter, I finally told my husband that I just could not live like this anymore, that I didn't want this kind of life for my children. And as much as I loved being a columnist and a journalist, that I was going to go back into higher education and back to being a professor in a place where my children could grow up safe. I never talked about what was happening to me in my columns, because I felt even though I had a platform, that by talking about what happened to me, I would incite that person to come after my children. So they really had leverage against me in a way that I felt that if I retaliated in any way, I'd put myself and my family at risk. So I left the newspaper and started a project right after that, or while I was still at the newspaper, called Spot Hate, that was going to look at newspaper reports of hate crimes across the US and marry that with the Southern Poverty Law Center database of hate groups across the US. At the time, they didn't have it digitized and in a mapping format that we might be able to use it, and I encouraged them to take that data, and if you go to the Southern Poverty Law Center site now, you'll see that there is a map that shows you all the different types of hate groups operating across the US, and what I wanted to do was marry that with newspaper reports of what was happening across the US so we could see were these reports in areas or in places where these groups were operating, because the letters I got were not the one-off letters. These were hate groups that used this as a tactic to shut down diverse voices in our media. And they used this as a tactic of fear and intimidation to try and get me to leave the newspaper. And
Michelle, so what would you tell? What would you tell young women in the same position if it's this a sexualized attack or a racial attack online that they should do? You left.
I left. I fought and then I left.
Because you can't, I mean, yes. I think as you say so beautifully in the book, that you can't really tell people how hard that is until they've experienced it.
Until they've experienced it. And I think Lara said telling the story. Actually, a lot of folks did not know the story, including some of my family, because it did feel so shameful that I'm being under attack. I didn't understand why I was under attack. The types of columns I wrote very rarely had a news peg that focused on anything racial or anything that was in the news. And yet here I was under attack for talking about teaching my kids how to ride bicycles or taking them to field trips and what the experience was like for me as a mother. And so what would I tell to women? I would say that I picked my time to come to the fight. And I picked that time 10 years later. Now my kids are grown. Most of them have left the house. And I feel it was an opportunity for me to revisit the problem of online harassment because I was an online community manager at this newspaper. I've been involved in online forums since they were born. And since there was a World Wide Web. So I've seen these offline behaviors migrate into online spaces as we've tried to moderate online comments in our news sites, et cetera. And I think the challenge is that our media are now requiring everyone, not just columnists, but all of our media people to be present in social media and don't understand, I think, the real consequences and risk of what they're asking people to do and becoming public figures like that and exposing them to these online groups, smart mobs, that operate very much like hate groups in trying to shut down diverse voices online of women and people of color.
And Molly, thank you very much. Molly, how widespread, not just online, but sexual attacks, and does gender really have an added?
Well, I think online, definitely, we've seen time and time again that women are subject to so much verbal abuse online. I, as a foreign correspondent, but also as, I've written some personal finance articles about, paying down student debt or how to save for a mortgage that have had some really vicious comments in them that has just really surprised me because, like you were saying, there's, we're talking about personal finance. How am I insulting anybody out in the world? In person, though, I think, we've spoken a little bit about conflict zones. But really, as a freelance foreign correspondent, I'm aware that at any point, any place in the world, a situation can turn for me. I travel solo. I don't have a major publication backing me up or will come in to get me if I run into trouble. And so that's something that I'm very, very aware of.
And gender, do you believe, is an added risk?
I do, absolutely. Some of the places in the world that I have been reporting from, I've definitely been hyper-aware that I'm a female, that I'm a Western female, that I do not blend in places. I'm tall. There's not every place I can just blend in very well. And no, I attract a certain amount of attention. I attract a certain amount of people's perceptions about what it means to be an American female traveling alone in the world, what it means to be a journalist, a female journalist traveling alone in the world. And I've been followed. I've been stalked. I was in Senegal 2 weeks ago, and there were strange men outside of our apartment for days at a time. The same few men were at the same restaurants we went to everywhere we went. We were followed down the street. We had photographs taken of us, and that was relatively benign. We were not harmed. We were not touched. I've had situations where I've been in the air and have landed and have gotten alerts that all of my social media and email accounts have been compromised from a town that I have not ever been in for 5 hours while I was in the air. And these are not the standard, oh, please update your password sort of emails. These are your account has been breached. So those are the sorts of things that I'm always aware of, particularly as a female, particularly as a journalist, particularly as an American journalist who spends a lot of time abroad. I think, anywhere we go, there's always a potential for everything. Even in places in the world that I thought I would be the most safe, I have been surprised, and I've let my guard down a little bit. I've been surprised at some of the attention, reactions, threats that I've unexpectedly have to deal with.
Lara, I want to go back to you. And before Egypt, had you thought about specific threats on women? I have to say, whenever I was in a war zone, I didn't think about that. What I did think about was, if something happens to me as a mother, I'm going to get more criticism than a man for what the heck are you doing over there anyway. But I hadn't thought about it before you.
No, I said this to Sandy about CPJ earlier, that I'm not surprised CPJ didn't do anything about this particular issue before, because I think we experienced it and we all just thought it was a part of life. I mean, I remember when I was a young journalist in Afghanistan on my own, and the Afghan general at the front would say, stay, don't go. And after a while I realized, why am I going? I should just stay on the front line. And then the first thought in my head was, well, you know, am I going to be safe? And my very first night on the front line, I remember being woken up by a bunch of Afghans with, you know, their AKs and putting their hand over my face to wake me up. And it didn't mean anything, actually. They were just waking me up. But, you know, they didn't know what to do with a woman like me. They hadn't seen a woman in public in Afghanistan for 8 years at that point under the Taliban. And they took, and I remember them saying, like, coming like this. And no one spoke English. And I was completely on my own. And the Taliban had control over most of the country at that time. So there was no electricity, you know, there was none of those things. So it was very dark. And they said, you know, come, and I just had to go with them because I didn't have a choice. And that's when I thought, oh shit, this is when the general, you know, takes his
I'm
rent.
sure we'll bleep that out. You hang
live.
around these women, you're going to hear that, you know? It gets worse with every deployment, too, right? You can always tell when you've been overseas.
So the worst is when you can teach the soldiers how to swear.
Yes, right, yeah.
But, you know, when we were walking in the dark, I thought, what am I going to? You know, like, am I going to be raped by the general? God, I hope not. And, you know, and so that was just one of the normal things that you built into it. But I do remember being in Iraq just before the invasion of Saddam, and I'm being under a lot of pressure from my male colleagues because I was the only one who wanted to stay. And I remember being heavily criticized because they said, you're just a little girl who wants to get your face on TV and you don't care what happens to us because as men, we have to protect you if they come after you. And you don't care if you get raped by all the Republican guards. You just want to be famous, sort of thing. That was literally what I had to deal with. And still a little bit bitter about it, I have to be honest. But I've worked with them since and gotten over it. But that is, I feel that women are under an extraordinary amount of pressure from their male colleagues sometimes, that is something that's leveraged, you know, for and against us. Because if I was a young guy and I'd wanted to stay, no one would have said anything like that. And you know, of course, it wasn't true. I just figured that you never had 100 journalists die in any invasion, that the odds of surviving, because there were about 1,000 of us and we were down to like 100 at that point, odds of surviving were pretty good, and as it turns out, I would have been right.
Arzu, I want you to tell us about your experiences and your friend and colleague, an investigative journalist in Azerbaijan, who is one of the best investigative journalists there, who is in prison now, and her story and your story.
Sure. Well, actually, since we've talked a little bit about family, I would like to mention what Khadija said at some point. After she started doing investigative reporting and exposing the ruling family and exposing the corruption and exposing all the offshore companies that were related to the ruling family, there was an interview with her where she said that she made a conscious choice at some point in 2010, 2011 that she didn't want to have a family. And that was linked to a murder of another journalist colleague of ours in 2007 who was murdered in front of his apartment. And he, too, was an investigative reporter. He had a magazine that he ran in Azerbaijani and Russian. And he, too, did a lot of sort of corruption investigation. And he was murdered. He left behind a wife and a kid. And it was then that Khadija decided that this journalist who was killed, he was alone when he was doing it, and that there needed to be more investigative reporters going and digging about what's happening in the country. But also, she realized that she didn't want to have, she didn't want to have this sort of terrible tragedy, leaving family behind. And she made a conscious choice, and a lot of us were. We questioned that. I think I asked myself this question when I decided to get married, and I was wondering whether or not I should do it. But I did get married, and I don't have kids, and I think that's also kind of goes back to that question that I don't want anything happen to my children, especially because I live in Turkey, and Turkey is also not the safest place for journalists, especially in the light of what's been happening recently. And kind of linking it to my own story, I mean, I traveled back to Azerbaijan, originally from Azerbaijan, but I lived in Turkey since 2010 for personal reasons. My husband was Turkish, but I traveled back and forth to do work, to do research, to do trainings. And in 2014, it was my first sort of first-hand experience of being defamed by the authorities on television channels. and being sort of exposed and called a traitor because the government wasn't really happy with my reporting, my critical reporting of the government, but it also wasn't really happy of my engagement in reconciliation. I was doing a lot of work with Armenia at the time. I was co-directing a small not-for-profit organization that did dialogue programs between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. But the funny thing is, when I was called a traitor and they made an enemy of the state out of me and talked about this in newspapers and on TV, they never mentioned anything about my critical reporting. They always mentioned my Armenia link and how I was writing for an Armenian paper in Istanbul, and I was selling government secrets and exposing the lies, and it was not, everything that I was writing was untrue. And this was a very common method to go after journalists in Azerbaijan. It still is. I mean, calling someone a traitor is the easiest way to get public support because we're in a war with Armenia, and there are a lot of people who are fed propaganda every day for the 20 years. And so when you don't have transparent education, when you don't have alternative means of information, a lot of people just listen what the government says, and when the government says, this person is a traitor, that's it. Everyone thinks that you're a traitor, sadly. And so this sort of defamation campaign, I thought, okay, this will pass, because in the past I received emails, hate emails, I received messages, but this was something beyond that, because 2014 was also the year when the government went after its most prominent critics, arresting, jailing people like Khadija Ismailova, my friend, but also going after human rights defenders, representatives of civil society organizations, members of political movements, young activists, youth activists, because they thought these people were posing danger to the legitimacy of the government. And that was also the first time when I got my first death threats. And I have to say, I mean, up until that point, I would hear all these stories from other journalists who've been receiving death threats, and it never really occurred to me the emotional state that this would, put you in. And it was the first time I started, checking. Every time I would leave my apartment in Istanbul, I would look behind, and I thought it was really silly after some time. But in the beginning, that state, that emotional state it puts you in, is actually quite frightening. Not physically frightening, but you think that you're going crazy. And that someone is constantly watching you. I mean, eventually I got over it, but it was really difficult to see how much hate there was, and online harassment and online sexual harassment. The messages and the tweets and the posts on Facebook were just, people would discuss how they would rape me and how they would like to see me being killed, or how I should be brought to justice by being raped and being shown how a traitor should be treated. And I think at some point I just stopped reading all of this because I just realized how damaging it was myself, just not handling it or not being able to handle it. I remember for a few months I decided to stop reading and not respond to my friends sending me all these links, because I guess in a way they were trying to help me to show what was written about me, but in a way it was not helping at all because it was actually quite damaging. But I remember that after those few months, I think I really took only 2 months or 3 months off. I decided that, okay, I needed to talk about this, I needed to share this, because I didn't know how to deal with it otherwise. And so I started writing about it and more openly speaking about the experience that I had. And again, I'm just lucky I didn't have physical assault, but I think the online aspect of it just proved how much online just applies to offline, and how much impact it has on you. And in the general picture, what was happening in the country just made total sense. The government was targeting not only people who were in the country, but also people who were outside the country, and defaming them and continue to defame them. I mean, this harassment still continues. It's not like the government decided, okay, we're not going to touch Arzu anymore. And it's just really incredible how that impacts you. And really, at some point, I really did think that I should stop. And the thing that you mentioned about going to academia, in the summer of 2014, I got a phone call from my brother, who was in Azerbaijan at the time. Luckily, he's no longer in the country. But it was the first time when the government used my brother to pressure me, and he started yelling at me on the phone. So you have to make a statement. You have to make a public statement, post it on your social networks, and tell them that you no longer will be writing anything critical of the government, and that you're going back to academia and to deal with your family. I'm like, what is going back to academia have to do with any
Okay,
of this?
my idea is that we have a reality show where we go to the people's houses, we find out where they are with the heavily armed men and women,
And we kill them.
and ask and say, really, you think, you're going to say that about me? Look where you're, whatever
Well,
you're
but
doing.
isn't that the most
It's not
damaging
reality.
thing about online harassment? You don't know where it's coming from.
Yes,
If somebody,
exactly.
and please don't, but if somebody in this audience were to stand up and yell threats at us, we would know who you are and what you look like, and we would know to avoid you on the metro, right? If somebody harasses us online, it could be anybody. It
And
could
you can
be
say they're cowards,
anywhere.
but if they, if you're getting threats like
Exactly.
that or like that.
And I mean, I've had people tell me that they could find me and give very specific information about my movements in Washington.
they could.
And they could. And I mean, please
so
again,
let's
please
find
don't.
them first. That's
Well, and
There
We're
actually
gonna
is
send
a
Lara
reality
to
show,
find
Martha.
them. Yes.
I'll torture them before I beat them to death. No, I'm just kidding. No, there's two quick things I want to say about that. One is that one of the most frustrating things about it is how powerless you are, because people can say whatever they like online, and they have complete anonymity, and they make up stuff, and they write as if they have authority about you, and they make all kinds of accusations about you, and there's no fair game in any of this, and they can accuse you of this or that, and they may be guilty of exactly that. They can say you're politically motivated, but they could be paid by someone on the left or the right to be doing what they're doing, and that powerlessness, I think we should recognize that as a society, because it's not right when it happens to anyone. I've experienced it too, and the stress and pressure that it puts you under is hard to articulate.
It's not just
I
the
wanna-
psychological, though. I mean, you're talking, there's a
Yeah.
psychological impact, there's also an economic impact. When your digital identity and your reputation is destroyed in this way, there's the short-term impact on you being able to put your life and your identity back together. If you're employed by a major employer or you have a job, you might still have that job. If you're a freelancer, you've now lost your ability to earn an income, because whenever anybody Googles your name, they're now going to get all the garbage that's been spread about you online as well. And so there's a couple of solutions, I think, embedded in what we've heard here. And Lara talking about the support of her colleagues and others in rallying around her and allowing her to be able to tell the story in the way that she wanted that story to be told, in the ways that you get support from friends and others to be able to continue to do the work that you do. I think that's really critical as well.
I want to go down and start with you, Lara, on that very point, which is, do you think, since you talked about what happened in Tahrir Square, that things have gotten better for women in war zones?
I think, well, not in the reality on the ground, because it's more dangerous now than ever for women anywhere. But I think two things about that. One is, I realized when I read academic papers on sexual violence in Egypt, was to look at it as a system of control. And I understood from the very beginning that it wasn't personal. It actually wasn't about me. I mean, I was selected as a target because it sent a very powerful message from their point of view. But this is used as a tool against women all the time in many societies all over the world. And it's very difficult for women to speak out about it in many places. We're lucky that in the U.S. the conversation has begun, and what is better is that this is something that is acknowledged and it's not hidden, and people accept it, and you have an environment in which you can talk about it. But I don't think that that's the reality in most places. And I also don't think that no one at work wants to hear me talk about, oh, that reminds me of when I was being raped in Tahrir Square, or something like that. It's like, it's a conversation that we don't go there. Like, we've done that. You talked about it. Now, can you please never mention it again, because it makes all of us extremely uncomfortable. And so that's where I find now that the more useful conversation is about living with that and what that actually means. So I don't think it's any safer. I mean, the attacks that happened on New Year's Eve in Cologne and in Sweden and in Finland and in other places are an indication that that form of predatory violence, sexual violence, is a tool that I think is only going to, I mean, the indicators are that it's going to increase. Because it's about silencing the media. It was about making sure that female foreign journalists didn't want to go to Egypt to cover that. It was sending a message to Egyptian female journalists not to cover that war, right?
Well,
And
Reporters Without Borders in November of 2011 came out and said, stop sending journalists to Egypt.
Well, but
That
and it's
there
not
was an
just
uproar
Egypt.
about that.
It would be great if it was just the evil Egyptians, right? But come on, it's like that happens everywhere in different forms. It's just, and I think with what governments across that part of the world are facing and what they stand to lose, I don't think it's going to get any better for female journalists, and also men are just as vulnerable. Male journalists are just as susceptible. A man against a mob of 200 to 300 men has got his, he's going to be raped as easily as I was.
Arzu, you want to?
Yeah, and I think I would like to point to the security of freelance female journalists, because I think that adds a very different way to the issue. And recently I had a friend who was detained in Bahrain, and she's a freelance reporter, and she was detained with her crew. And I was happy to be within the community of people who tried to help as much as we could. But then after she was out, I was thinking this could happen to anyone. And not just in Bahrain, but any other country. And what do you do when you're a freelance female reporter? I mean, yes, do you have a support network? Well, do you really? I mean, and you don't have the same rights as
Probably
a
not.
full-time
Continue.
reporter for an established media platform, for instance. And that creates a whole set of other issues. You have to take care of your own insurance. You have to take care of many other things. It's some of the things that we were talking earlier today during lunch.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And talk a little more about that, Molly.
About which part?
About how, whether or not things have improved in a way since Lara came out and talked about it, her experiences, what you're seeing, and particularly as a freelance journalist.
I mean, I think definitely the conversation in the States is much better, much healthier, much more open. And again, I don't think on the ground it's changed at all. I mean, I am as a freelancer responsible for her own safety, I'm very selective about where I go in the world. There are places I would go in the world. There are places that I think stories are not being told, journalists are not there right now. But I have to make the business decision to protect myself, my safety, and my health. And yes, I pay for my own health insurance. Thankfully, the worst thing I've ever gotten is a black eye on the job. But one broken leg or one stray bullet, and that impacts the rest of my life in terms of medical bills, careers, what I can write. And these are things that I think about every single day. And yet, I still can't imagine doing anything else as a profession. I will never be rich and I will never be safe, but I also can't imagine ever changing jobs.
Can you, I want to talk about this, and we've talked about all the challenges and sexualized attacks and that adding an element of risk, but I want each of you to talk about what a female journalist can bring to coverage that a man may not be able to. And I know a lot of us don't like to say, oh, I'm the girl, I can talk about this differently. But is there something unique that female journalists can bring that males cannot?
I don't know that I'm comfortable answering that question for exactly the things that you just described. I think that it's very easy for us to fall into female journalists versus male journalists when it comes to gendered violence or gendered coverage or the things each of us can or cannot do. But I think that those lines are so blurred and so individual based on what each person brings to the job that I wouldn't even feel comfortable speculating.
I'm happy to answer my own question,
Please
by
do.
the way.
What's your own question, Martha?
Yes, thank you, Lara. But I'm going to ask you all as well. And I think over the years I've fought sort of when everybody asks the question. I'm sure especially you, Lara, especially me in those areas. What's it like being a woman covering? And I finally come to realize that I am not just a female journalist covering wars. I am a mentor. And that for other young women and other young men, to see me doing that, to see all of you doing what you do, is a lesson. And it's a powerful lesson for people to see. So I've embraced that. And I also I do think, I mean, in very practical ways, we can go into the tent with the women when the men can't go in there and talk to them. And whether that's, I mean, obviously that's just the way society is built over there, but we do have unique gifts in many ways, and I'm happy to embrace those, but took me a long time to get there too.
I will say, though, to add that I've been really amazed at how, and not amazed probably is the wrong word, but encouraged by how wonderfully supportive the network of female freelance foreign correspondents particularly has been. Even though we're not all in the same place or we all have the same employer, it is a really small society of women that do what we do. And I know with IWMF and Global Journalism Security, I keep running into the same people that I never would have met.
Like I did with Lara in Baghdad, I remember so well.
We're on different continents, but there's such a small group of people that do what we do that it's really amazing at how supportive and encouraging, whether it's here's a fixer in Dakar, or here's an editor that would run this piece, or you know, hey, you need a room in Tallinn, I've got somebody to talk to. So that has been really helpful.
So Martha, just to answer your question, I think that it works both ways, that there are many, there are many situations in which men have an advantage over you because they can relate as men to other men. And there are other, situations where people completely underestimate you because you're a woman, and that allows you to get away with murder. And then there are the obvious situations. I mean, for me, the one thing that has particularly changed is when I sat with the Yazidi women talking to them about their experiences of being raped and sexual slaves and slavery. You know, I had 2 young Yazidi girls come to my hotel room, and I had lunch with them and spent a few hours with them, and I talked to them about being raped and what it had been like for me, and that created a kind of bond between us, where I think that they felt they were able to talk about it. I don't think they could believe that I could talk about it as openly as I did, and so that, in a way, like for me, was something that I could feel I could give something back of myself, because I never like to just take from everyone that I talk to and interview and spend time with. I always, often you don't have anything really to give except what, you can give respect, and you can give understanding, and you can give your full time and attention and commitment to their story, but you don't really have a lot else. And now I can give something else too. I can give some more of myself to help have a better conversation. And the other part of that is I feel the limitations of being a woman in that I haven't been able to go and cover Al-Qaeda the way that I would have liked to have covered it.
Some interviews we will not get because they're never going to give them to a woman.
And that's a downside. That's missing from the conversation. That's from a very important conversation that we should all be having. So I see that as a loss.
Let me, before we open it up to questions, just go down the line. And I know we've talked a little about solutions, but what you see happening next? What would be the most productive thing to happen from a conversation like this, from this book?
Oh, let's start with Lara. Do me last.
Okay.
I have to think about that one.
You want to start?
Sure. Well, I think when I think in particular, again, in case of Azerbaijan, I think in our case there's not been enough pressure on the government and on the authorities. They continue to persecute journalists and critics of the government, and I think there's always been a very welcome, sort of warm welcome here in the U.S. I mean, our president was here just a few weeks ago for the Nuclear and Security Summit, and he got a meeting with Kerry, he got a meeting with Joe Biden, he got a photo with President Obama at the White House, both of them smiling and looking quite happy. Now, I don't know what they talked about behind closed doors. They might have talked about human rights, they might have talked about democracy, but I don't know. And the fact is, as soon as he went back, not only we had an escalation in conflict between Armenia, but we also had more criminal investigations and more allegations against independent journalists. So I think there needs to be, if we are talking about concrete steps, we need to really rethink how we treat countries like Azerbaijan. Obviously, the strategic interests are, I understand politically, yes, Azerbaijan is important because of its geographical location, but I also think that democracy and human rights can no longer be on the bottom of the priority list, because you see that the partners that you worked with or you coordinate with or you did projects with are actually in jail or go in and out of jails as part of the revolving door policy that our government so easily and finally implements. So more government pressure, and I think, we really need to get real. If Magnitsky Act was possible, I think Democracy Act for Azerbaijan, there is a Democracy Act at the moment, the discussion is also possible. And really, if here, America is where the changes are happening, I think it really needs to extend this change to other countries as well.
10 years ago, when I experienced this and went to different organizations, my male colleagues would, say it's a badge of honor if you're getting these kinds of letters. Fast forward now, 10 years, and I've seen a tremendous shift, especially with the online conversations, because it is so much more public, right? You can see what other people are tweeting. You can see what other people are putting on social media. And those of us that have been targets are very much more public about sharing that with other people. Fast forward 10 years from my own experience, a year ago I started an organization called Trollbusters, designed to support women journalists and women writers online. So in the moment of attack, we send them positive messages. We send them that love and support. We send them the information about how to deal with these smart mobs who are sending out your public information about where you live to their mobs so that they can come to your home and attack you. We try and help them understand what they can do emotionally, technologically with their sites and their information, as well as helping them be able to stay online and make sure that their voice stays strong. So that's a real solution that I'm working on right now as a result of my experiences. But policy-wise, our laws are designed for the one-off crime where you know who's done the attack to you. So our revenge porn networks are fairly robust in terms of people who deal with revenge porn, because you usually know who's taken the naked picture of you, okay? Generally.
Did you say revenge porn?
Yeah,
Is that what you said?
I did revenge porn.
I have never heard of that.
Okay. So in revenge porn, people know
TV.
those naked pictures, usually who they're coming from, and you could go after that person with smart anonymous mobs, whether it's Gamergate or other different types of groups. They're all there, they're persistent, they're consistent, they respawn new identities, and so you have a very difficult legal path to hoe as somebody who's a target of this to really get any recourse for this type of activity. You can block it, you can stop the trolls, they'll respawn and create new identities. So this is really a much more insidious kind of activity than what we've seen in the past and the kinds of one-off attacks that might happen in physical space. So we need better laws that actually deal with the complexity of the kind of online activity that we're seeing with these smart mobs. We need better training of our law enforcement. And in fact, Representative Clark has put in legislation to provide funding for law enforcement to help them better understand how to investigate online crimes, and we've signed on to that. And then we need education of our young journalists. I'm a journalism educator, and while I lost my voice in the newspaper, I've created hundreds of other new voices that have gone out there to do journalism. So I feel like I may have lost my own voice, but I've spawned 1,000 other voices. But our young people are not savvy enough about what's happening both in physical and online spaces, and don't understand the ways in which they expose themselves constantly by posting certain kinds of information that make them, that expose them personally to their own privacy and physical space, and then also that give indicators and make them attractive targets for these types of groups.
These are, both just amazing and excellent suggestions. One of the things I would really like to see as well is more engaged and informed consumers of news and responsible consumers of news. I hope today we shared a little bit about what it takes for us to deliver news to you. We see time and time again that the rates for journalists are going down, the salaries are going down. I know as a freelancer, I get offered some rates that I think they're kidding and actually have asked if they're kidding, which they don't always appreciate. But so please, by all means, if you're enjoying foreign coverage or reading foreign coverage or want to see more foreign coverage in a particular area, please subscribe to a newspaper, pay for a firewall, subscribe to a magazine, donate to a journalism organization, help fund a scholarship. I mean, it's not journalists against readers. We're all in this together at this point now, and social media and commenting, good and bad, trolls or no trolls, have made it all easier for us to engage with each other. So please be more active and engaged and with us on this journey.
Lara.
So the thing I would like to see come out of it is, I guess, more responsibility from the media itself. If we don't want to be consumed by social media, then we have to be the ones who stand up and make sure that that doesn't happen. And it's not okay if it happens to another journalist and you're thinking, oh, as long as it's not me, it's okay. You know, or maybe they deserved it, or maybe they didn't. But whatever they did, they didn't deserve the onslaught that they got. I was shocked the other day to see a major newspaper had an article about something that happened, and the reaction that they quoted to that, they took from comments of the internet. I was like, oh, so you've got some anonymous person who might be sitting in their underwear masturbating while they wrote this email, you know, and you're going to put that in a national newspaper as if you were giving credibility to those views. I mean, you know, there's a lot of crap out there, let's face it. Or you look on any of those sites, I mean, I have to not look. Because I can have the most innocuous story air on 60 Minutes about something that, you know, everybody really cares about. And there's crazy people go on there and write all this vicious, you know, nasty stuff. And we give if you don't want us to lose our voice, we have to fight for that voice. And I think we're partly responsible for that. And we should call people out. Don't put organizations that are paid political organizations in as media watchdogs in the newspaper. Don't do that. That's not honest. You know, we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard of reporting and help people in the public understand the distinction. You know, you think it's, all the mainstream media is controlled by, I don't know, little rich white men who have got this worldview that they're forcing down all of our throats. And everything that's, you know, blogged or online is real free speech and the real story that we're hiding from you. Well, come on. That's just like, that's ridiculous. That's so far, you know, to the extreme. And if we want the only way our jobs are going to mean anything and the work that we do is going to mean anything is if people go to the recognized brands that they know they can trust. And that can be, you know, a blogger who's built credibility over time and has done good work. But if we don't hold ourselves to those standards, then, you know, we're kind of giving up the territory and we can't whine about it afterwards.
Thanks. Thanks, all of you. And we'll open it up to questions now. Anybody got a question? Nobody. I'm going to call on you, John, if there's no question. I knew you wouldn't let me down. I knew it. This is John Williams, who is the foreign editor at ABC News. Oh, pardon me. Yeah, is there a mic?
There's over here.
Okay. Oh, there it is.
We've got two.
I'd like to ask the other taboo question.
Closer to the mic. I love saying that.
Yeah?
Come on. Yeah.
I'd like to ask the other taboo question, really, which is whether you think it would have taken this long to have this conversation if there were more women in the senior levels of management.
Absolutely not.
In news organizations.
Are you talking yourself
not.
out of a job?
Yeah, did you just want a big hurrah there, John?
Yes.
Well,
Are you resigning?
When we look
honestly,
at...
it's a genuine question. You know, Lara talked about, you know, when she was after her attack, the way that there was support, but embarrassment. And, you know, it's just so important to strip the taboo away. And I do wonder whether actually it would, like so many things, we talk about diversity, and in many ways, you know, news organizations have come a long way in terms of diversity. There's a long way still to go, and the executive class is still from one strata.
I'm just going to chime in here because, as you well know, I'm a pretty loud voice at ABC, and I wish there were more of them. I wish there were more female voices. I know Lara is a loud voice at CBS, and I mean, it's incredibly important to have to have diversity in senior management. I feel a huge, I'm not in senior management, but I feel a huge responsibility at my news organization to speak up, to let people know what it's like, to do whatever I can.
When I was at the Online News Association this past year, they had a keynote on online harassment. And one of the most shocking things to me, was literally the number of women in the audience who were weeping and tweeting because they had never told their stories to management. They assumed this was part of the job. They'd stuffed it down. They didn't talk to anybody about going to city council meetings and being propositioned or being threatened or anything else. And I had senior managing editors of newspapers come up to me, males, who said, I never realized this was happening. It's because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And just because you haven't heard about it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And so initiate the conversations in your newsrooms about what people should do when these types of things happen. And the response of my newspaper was for me to take a colleague out with me when I went to go to my car at night at 1 o'clock in the morning. Maybe push them in front of the bullet. I'm not sure what that was supposed to do. But that's not a solution, and because we don't have women in leadership and because we are speaking out, whether we're here online or whether we're in higher education, being a voice and an advocate for inclusive and diverse spaces for our students, we are targets all the time. And we need to have those allies, whether they're upper administration males, if that's where they are, or people in management in our media organizations, recognizing that this is a problem and initiating the conversations, even if there aren't the women there to speak up about it.
And I just want to clarify, I received an extraordinary amount of support at CBS from my male bosses in the wake of the attacks, and the embarrassment and discomfort came from that. I think when men are around a woman who's just been raped, their feeling, the way my male colleagues described it to me, is they didn't want to violate me even more by looking at me or asking me questions or doing anything at all. So two of my male colleagues, Max McClellan and Jeff Newton, who I have worked with and lived through so many things with. We've been through divorce together, we've been through babies born together, we've been through war zones together. I mean, everything you can imagine, Darfur, refugee camps, you name it. And I was too scared to sleep alone in my hotel room, and I begged them to sleep with me, and they both slept on the floor. And they wouldn't even take a pillow or anything off the bed. And it's an odd thing because not that I wanted to be touched, but it was very lonely because there was a distance between us that had never ever been there before, and I knew that I have spent a lot of time bridging that distance. When I came back to 60 Minutes, remember the sound man Bert, who I'd known forever, he was like, he didn't want to put the microphone on me, sort of didn't want to touch me, and so when he came close, I went like that, and I pretended to bite him, and he like jumped back, and I said, "Come on, Bert, I'm just fucking with you, it's me," and try to kind of settle the tension in the room, because sexual assault is something that we're just not comfortable talking about. Over here.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to ask a question. This is kind of like a weird, broad question, but I just kind of wanted to ask about what you thought new media was doing as far as conflict coverage is concerned, because my little experience, writing about conflict zones, particularly in Turkey, I found that I could connect with journalists so much easier thanks to this kind of new media through Twitter, through organizations like HostWriter online that's been able to connect me to credible journalists cover in conflict zones. So I ask, we talked a lot about the disadvantages of new media as far as being a woman in attacks, but what are some
Here
of
is
the
your
good
woman
things?
to answer that question.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to answer that question.
Too.
So I think in both Turkey and Azerbaijan, online media has played an incredible role in not just conflict coverage, but any kind of news coverage. In Azerbaijan, where traditional media is almost non-existent, and whatever media that's out there is either pro-government and doesn't cover independently what's happening. Facebook has become the news gathering platform. I mean, I go every day, every morning on Facebook, and I read what my friends are posting from Azerbaijan, because that's where I'm getting news. Same in Turkey. I mean, when Gezi protests were happening in 2013, the shutdown of social media platforms attested to the importance of how much they played into sharing news. WhatsApp became an alternative news sharing way of people texting each other and saying, oh, there's police there, there's police there. So in this day and age, I feel like it is an incredibly important tool, or a very important platform. I use it myself as a blogger, as an online journalist, but I think it should not, its importance should not be, it should not be overlooked at the expense of what actually it can mean to people who use it. So, once you're online, once you're on Facebook, in particular in case of Azerbaijan, for instance, you expose yourself. You speak about things that normally no one else speaks. And so, and Azerbaijan is known for using surveillance. So, when people get arrested, they're actually shown screenshots of what they've been posting on Facebook, and that's extremely dangerous. And similarly in Turkey, the crackdown is a little bit different. But again, it's quite important to know how to protect yourself. Either do it, covering your IP address or whatnot. Important, but also slightly dangerous. Yeah.
Sure.
Given the importance that we all attach to the First Amendment, how legally do you see any possibility of dealing with this horrendous assault that you experience?
Legally, is there any recourse?
I mean, for me personally,
I mean, you were
sorry.
saying, I'm sorry, I think you were saying they wouldn't do anything.
I think legal recourse, the police and none of the agencies that I went to would do anything until there was an actual attack, right? So the threats themselves, the implicit threats, they won't act on that. They'll only act on those explicit threats. And so the tactic really is fear and intimidation. Mm-hmm. It's a chilling effect, a silencing effect to get you to stop doing what you're doing. Persisted for 3 years, but continued to speak out, continued to develop platforms to be able to get other people to speak, continued to try and fight back against that. But legally, there really was no opportunity and no recourse for me.
Well, and I think, too, there's always this line, and this is something I think we all come across, right, is absolutely we believe in the First Amendment. I believe in it. That's, to the extent of my livelihood. But I think we've also kind of lost sight of the fact that we are shared, we're in a shared community, right? Where are the manners involved? Like, yes, you absolutely could stand up and scream obscenities at any one of us, but why would you? And that, to me, is always this thing that I struggle with, where absolutely I want to hear everybody's perspective and points of view and stories, and that's my job, is to get those stories. But when it devolves into screaming comments and threats online, that's where I'm like, well, yes, you do have the right to say that, but why would you? What are you getting out of that by doing that? Except, making us all lock our doors double twice at night and looking behind our shoulders when we go out for grocery shopping. So that's, to me, is, yes, that, the First Amendment's there, and I hope it, is never eroded in any way, shape, or form. But, we're all humans, too.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
It just seems like online, maybe it's stripped away a level of civilization that when we're together, we have to observe.
Well, but I think that's spilled over, though, right? I don't want to play the "when I was younger, we were nicer to each other" card, but right? But I think definitely you see the in-person debates gotten a little bit more vitriolic. And
who hasn't fired off one of those emails where you've said things that, you might not have said in person?
Never. Me? Never. Never.
Thank you very much, sir.
This question may be too broad for this forum, and please don't misunderstand that I think you folks do the most marvelous job in the world. However, let me ask it this way. If this was a panel of female tennis players or female engineers or female truck drivers, would you all be saying essentially the same thing, or do you think your jobs, your choice is unique in the way in which women are treated in other professions?
Absolutely, because we do play a role in reporting and as gatekeepers to helping inform the public. And if women's voices aren't a part of that process, whether it's as a columnist or as a reporter or in management or as owners of publications and newspapers, we have lost a significant voice of people of color, of women, of others in our community. I don't see, there's a different level of mission, perhaps, to the work that we do as journalists that's very different, I think, than the types of professions that you're talking about here. And once you shut down those women voices, what are the other stories? So it's not just my voice you're shutting down. You're shutting down the voices of the stories of people I would have told had I had a platform to be able to do it.
I would say that we certainly have a unique job, but I would say the same things about female truck drivers or female engineers, that if they're facing some sort of sexualized assault or some kind of discrimination, they should have a voice. The thing I would add to what Michelle says is we can be a voice for them as well.
And I don't want us to sound like a bunch of whiny old women here. I mean, you know, everybody's got something to deal with. And I'm a fighter. I haven't minded the fact that all my career I've had to fight that sort of. So when Martha, when we started out, not only were women not allowed to go on television to report on foreign news because we wouldn't be taken seriously, but the first women who did it had to be very manly. And if you dared to wear perfume or makeup in a war zone, you know, nobody took you seriously. But that really didn't matter in the coup in Burundi and in the war in Angola, where, you know, I kicked all my male colleagues' butts in Angola living with their soldiers on the front line. And if we didn't, as Reuters news agency and all the guys I worked with, if we didn't report on that war literally didn't exist. And I think that's okay. Everybody's got something to deal with. I don't think it's all easy just because you're a man. You know what I mean? And I don't want to slip into this thing of, you know, all the white corporate men in positions of power are all bad and evil, because, I mean, I don't think that's true. And I don't think that helps us. I mean, diversity is a great thing, but it should also be survival of the fittest, and we should all fight to get where we get on merit, and hopefully enough of that gets through. And sometimes it doesn't, but you know what? It's like, that's life, right? I mean, thing I've learned as I've gotten older is everybody has something to deal with. And life, as my mother would say, everyone pays the piper. Nobody gets off scot-free. And life is hard for all of us. And the last thing I want is anyone to walk away from this thinking that we're whining about, you know, poor women. I mean, women everywhere face, you know, sort of discrimination or face difficulties because they're women. And, you know, and men have their fair share too.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, this is a play off the previous conversation or the previous question, acknowledging the freedom or the First Amendment issues, which we should also acknowledge as a singularly American protection. I'm curious about what you think about the responsibility of the platforms themselves. So Facebook, Twitter, how should they handle some of the attacks that are happening?
Basically, they're dealing with this issue very carefully. They've escalated their activity, particularly Twitter in the past year, with their Truth and Safety Council to try and recognize what's happening online. They get thousands and thousands and thousands of these types of complaints on a daily basis. So they don't have the capacity. They've basically abdicated their responsibility for the technology that they've built to the community to police itself. And so while they're looking at technological solutions, technology alone isn't going to solve this problem because it's a cultural problem. The trolls will always be there. They were there before there was social media. They're going to be there afterwards. So my philosophy is, why worry about what the trolls are doing? Why don't we do things to support the targets themselves?
So that's like Apple, right? I mean, like now this conversation's getting interesting. So I was having this conversation at the FBI just recently. I mean, Comey, the director, said at the Aspen Institute security conference last week, it cost the FBI $1.4 million to get that Apple phone unlocked. So my question is it because not enough people died in San Bernardino? If it had been 9/11 and the information to the hijackers was on that phone, would we have had a different conversation? How many dead Americans does it take to change the conversation? That's a question that I think is interesting to have answered. Because how you weigh privacy issues and how you weigh my whole life is about the First Amendment. I grew up in South Africa. I mean, I literally grew up watching people die for those freedoms. And the American Constitution wasn't a history lesson for us. It was something that we all believed in and that we fought for. And I couldn't believe more strongly in that. But my question to people on this issue is exactly that. What is the level at which it takes for you to adjust your expectation of privacy versus security? That's a fascinating conversation.
And
Over here. Oh, go ahead.
I actually have a major issue with Twitter and Facebook and how they deal with these things. I mean, the amount of takedown requests that Twitter gets from Turkey every year is incredible. Something going back to thousands and thousands. I mean, ever since, again, going back to the Gezi protests, ever since 2013, the reports, and these are, reports, public reports, you can actually go on Twitter and download them, and you will see how many, in comparison to other countries, for instance, Turkey has these takedown requests. So that's one thing. And then I feel like, if Twitter, for instance, doing this, and they are actually taking down content, I mean, how really they investigate, how much investigation they put into the accounts that they take down. I mean, often these are activists or journalists or outspoken critics, and I think it requires a lot more than just a government request to take down a tweet or an account. The same goes to Facebook. I mean, their real name policy is just extremely distorted. I think it needs a lot more work that needs to go into that. I mean, we've had, within the community of activists, international activists, I mean, there's been a few cases when accounts of activists whose whose personal safety was in danger, they've been using anonymous profiles. And then all of a sudden, Facebook comes and deactivates their account because either they've been reported or they realize this was not a real name, the person's real name. But really, like, don't you need to actually go and then investigate and see? I think these platforms really require a very sort of, I don't know, I'm sure they have the capacity to really employ people who know the countries really well, who speak the local languages, who know what's happening in the country in order to be able to actually say whether or not this account or this tweet should be taken down or not.
But legally, though, the problem is, especially with online harassment, you can go and you can get Twitter to block it or take down something, et cetera, but law enforcement wants the activity to persist so they can investigate it. Mm-hmm. So the person is caught in the short term and trying to make the decision, do I stop the short-term pain and forego the long-term ability to be able to pursue this? And they're caught between those two opposite things of stopping it or continuing the activity so that they can actually get some compensation at the other end.
Let me just add to this real quick. I mean, we saw that last year with Twitter when a gunman took out 2 journalists on air. We saw how quickly Twitter responded to that. And I think, absolutely there are issues of censorship that we need to be aware of. For the most part, community policing can be effective, but there are certain instances where it needs to stop. Yeah.
I think this is probably the last one.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a great panel of very brave, extraordinary journalists, and I don't think any further qualifier is needed, so thank you. I want to ask a question about preparing for sexual assault. There's one school of thought that women should be separated from men and given separate counseling and training in terms of preparing for sexual assault. There's another school of thought that men need to be part of the discussion, that we need to think about bringing in men and women because men are also sexually assaulted, as Lara pointed out, but it needs to be, and build from what the U.S. military has developed in terms of peer intervention, that it can't be an isolated solution. So I wonder if you'd like to respond to that. Thank you.
Lara, I'm going to give that one to you.
Well, I mean, without question, I think that men should be involved in the conversation. Not only does it just affect men, but do you want a father left out of a conversation if his daughter is the victim of sexual assault, or a brother isn't supposed to understand what happened to his sister? I mean, it just that doesn't make sense, right? It's not even rational, and no, maybe it's an instinctive reaction. And I also think it depends. You have a whole range of activities when you talk about sexual assault. I was just with a Yazidi woman who was held for, I think, just less than a year and a half, And by the first man who held her, his wife used to hold her down while he raped her. The very first night, he left her in a room after he raped her, and his 3 guards came in and raped her after him. She was with him for about 3 months. Then he put her in another building in the Islamic State where she was held in a room. She was tied to a bed naked for 3 months. She never wore clothes. I asked her, very pointed questions like, did they ever let you wash? She was never allowed to wash her. Once every 3 days, she was untied to eat. When they changed the bedclothes, I asked her, did they change the bedclothes ever? Did they wash the sheets? Yes, they would do that. What would they do with you when you did that? They would put her in the corner of the room. She wasn't allowed to sit. She would have to stand. She never wore clothes for 3 months. And then she was moved on to someone else who had 2 wives who would participate in the rapes until she managed to escape from that place. So so moving when I asked this woman, because as a Yazidi, I said, would you like to be married one day and to have children? And she said, never. And you, I think, from Azerbaijan can understand what it means for a woman like that to say that she never wanted to be married or to have children. So how do you begin to rebuild a woman like that? Can you do that without men being part of that conversation? I mean, I think that's impossible.
And early intervention training is also key as well with both sexes. I mean, what hell did he,
And they're part of the solution,
And
too.
they're part of the solution,
So, I mean,
absolutely.
they have to get the message out. I want to thank, I agree, this is an extraordinary group, and I'm proud to be part of it. And thank you all for coming today. And take Molly's advice. Get somebody to read newspapers, hire Molly, send her overseas, send her wherever she needs to go to tell the story she needs to tell. Thank you so much. Thanks to the CPJ and the Newseum. Thanks. Thank you.